evening and welcome to Between the Lines. I'm John Matisonn. My guest tonight is Professor Belinda Bozzoli. She's the Shadow Minister of Higher Education. That means she sits opposite Dr. Blade Nzimande, who is the Minister of Higher Education. She represents the Democratic Alliance. Professor Bozzoli studied at Wits in the tumultuous 60s and 70s. She then did a PhD at Sussex in sociology. She became a professor back at Wits, was an A-graded researcher, still is, and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Wits during that time, but she's now in Parliament. Belinda, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Now, you must feel a bit of déjà vu. I remember at Wits when your father was Vice-Chancellor of Wits, and there was plenty of demonstrations and tear gassing at Wits in those days.
There certainly were. The difference was the cause then was a cause against the entire state, whereas
Yes.
the cause now, I think, is in favor of an interest group, which is the students. And that gives an entirely different flavor to it.
Yes. Of course, in those days, the university was largely white, so that also created a different dynamic.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, the police force, people talk about it being illegitimate now. Then it was far, far more illegitimate. And any encroachment by the police on the campus was absolutely a taboo.
Well, you talk about the policing, and when I saw some, maybe it was private security people, picking up stones and rocks and throwing them at students. And I thought that is totally undisciplined and unprofessional. Have we learned anything since Marikana about public policing?
Well, we've learned very little. I noticed the Minister of Police the other day was on TV telling us that he is very committed to a proper public order policing style, and he won't allow his police to bring weapons onto campus, or at least not lethal weapons. So perhaps they have learned something. We have got rid of Piega, who seemed to have been part of the problem. So I think we've made progress in relation to the police, but I certainly don't think it's nearly far enough. They're not professional enough yet. Although, admittedly, those were private security guards who, as you say, behaved very badly indeed.
Yes, but I also watched on some of the television footage, and I can't be sure, but I did get the feeling that there were police who really weren't very well trained.
Yes, they should be able to control a crowd. I estimated one of the crowds that I was watching at about 200. The police should be able to control a crowd like that peacefully. There are methods. There's a whole systematic protocol that one uses. What we've proposed as the DA is that the police start setting up campus units, specialized units, along the same lines as those that they use during elections, when they actually train people to deal with the kinds of situations that arise during elections.
Which are very different from their normal criminal work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you have said that in one of your statements that the government is pitting universities against students. What do you mean by that?
Well, that has a long history. That I think right from the very beginning, right from the inception of the new ANC government, universities were seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
In what sense?
And the general tone in which they were spoken of is that they were institutions that had to somehow be fixed, they had to somehow be changed. Now, of course, some of that was absolutely valid. Universities were, took a particular, they were white, although no longer by 1994 entirely white. They did need to change, they did need to enter into the new era, but the tone and attitude towards them was always one of quite deep hostility. And I think that has continued until today. I think what's happening is the ministry is now much more on the side of the universities than it used to be. But the pitting of the students against the universities has become the modus operandi. And it's going to be very difficult for that to end.
I suppose when you say that, what you're referring to is that the loss of funds comes from government. I mean, what has really happened in the last 20 years is the percentage of university budgets coming from government has declined considerably as the number of students has gone up.
Yes, absolutely. The government has really neglected universities, financially speaking. They doubled the numbers of students between 1994 and 2014, from 500,000 in the system as a whole to 1 million in the system as a whole, which is a good thing. Our participation rate in universities is actually very low. And although there are many students who have enormous problems coping with universities, I think it was a necessary expansion to have undertaken. However, they undertook this expansion without the concomitant funding. And so the funding
that seems, I mean, frankly, slightly insane. I mean, how can you not budget when you do something like that?
It was very, very insane. I mean, when you think that the schooling system, the amount of money you get is tied to the sizes of your classes. So if you have a class bigger than a certain number, you get another teacher.
Yes.
So the whole system is built to ratchet up according to scale. But the university system was never funded like that, and so
classes just got larger.
Yeah, they crammed in more and more students, and therefore each academic had to teach more and more of them.
Yes.
And at the very same time, academics were being expected to do more and more research. So the system really has begun to fail. And because of the lack of funding, the fees became the only way in which universities could remedy the financial problems they found themselves in.
Yes, I've seen in your document the percentage that's gone to, that has come from government has declined from about 50% to something like 40%, and the number of donor funding has increased a little, and student funding has had to take up the difference.
Absolutely right. So just as, yes, the one went down by 10, the other went up by 10, and that the pressure of what's known as the shared funding system. The pressure on the shared funding system started to render it illegitimate. Because if you're going to use shared funding between students' fees and government funding, the share has to be it has to have some sort of moral or ethical basis to it.
Yes.
And I think it lost that ethical basis.
Which costs legitimacy, in fact.
Yes.
We're going to have to take a break. We'll be right back with Professor Belinda Bozzoli. And we're back talking to Professor Belinda Bozzoli about the state of our universities. Belinda, we have this wonderful constitution. It's supposed to deal with democratic issues in a democratic way. What has Parliament's role been?
In general, or are you talking in relation to...
Well, no, I mean in relation... Here we have a crisis. Parliament consists of representatives. They should be there to deal with the crisis.
Absolutely. In a proper functioning democracy, Parliament would have been right up front in this. Parliament has held a debate on the issue, an emergency debate called by ourselves and the IFP, and I think that's about it. I've called for our portfolio committee to have an emergency meeting. That call has been ignored.
Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure why it is. In some ways, it might be in the interests of government. Let's assume the portfolio committee is completely obedient to government wishes, which I think it generally is. But it might be in the interests of government to hold such a meeting, and to allow Nzimandi, say, to explain himself. But they've simply ignored my numerous requests.
But aren't these parliamentary committees sort of set pieces? In other words, they're not going to hold that meeting until the ANC has had a caucus meeting. It's gone to Luthuli House. They've come back with a decision how that parliamentary committee meeting is going to be handled, and then you'll come there with something sort of baked in.
Yes. There's been much made of the recent Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, which grilled a certain Mr. Motswaneng about his role in Parliament.
At the SABC, yes.
Very satisfyingly grilled him, but you can be sure that that was all planned in advance. This was not a sudden outbreak of parliamentary accountability. It was an ANC decision.
But actually, I happened to attend a lot of those meetings, and the previous meeting that they held, the same committee held with the SABC weren't allowed to address any of these controversial things. The ANC shut the discussion down.
So a decision had been made. So if our portfolio committee takes place, a decision of a similar sort will be made. Now, we as the opposition, and there are 3 members on that committee who really try and play a very active role, the 2 DA members and the EFF member.
Yes.
We try and disrupt that set piece as much as we possibly can, but the opportunities are limited. Parliament has been defanged, and this is where it becomes quite obvious.
Yeah. In the remaining time, I want to, before the break, I want to ask you a question. We may have to continue a little after the break, and that is, how would you handle things differently than Blade Nzimande has done so far?
Well, the easy answer, I suppose, is I would not have got myself into this position in the first place. I think we do have a minister here who has only a minimal interest in his ministerial role, and who is really mainly interested in his role as chair of the Communist Party of South Africa. And so he hasn't done what needed to be done right from the get-go, right from the moment he came in, which was to challenge the funding model with Treasury. In fact,
in 2012, he did produce, his department did do an investigation and came up with a report and recommendations in 2012.
Correct.
Has that been implemented?
Not a single word of it has been implemented. If you're talking about the report chaired by Cyril Ramaphosa, ironically,
yes,
that report recommended more funding and it really has been ignored. And it was a substantive report. I can't actually see this fees commission that is sitting at the moment coming up with much better of a report. It was very good. It advocated exactly what was needed, which was more money and many other things. And very little of it, in fact, most of it, I think, has been ignored.
So we don't actually need commissions and reports. We don't need, sorry to interrupt, but we don't need any more commissions or reports.
Exactly. All that needs to be said was already said in that one.
Yeah. Now, you have said that you could make savings of 9.5 billion in government to go to it. Where would that come from?
Well, last year we actually did find 9.5 billion rand that we believe could be saved, but it was made through 330 amendments to the budget. We spent a long time combing the budget, the entire budget, and we found items to the value of 9.5 billion rand that we believed were superfluous, to need. Some of them were small, and some of them were large. The largest one was actually the cost of our missions abroad. The Department of International Relations oversees the second highest number of foreign missions in the world, only to the US. And the cost of that to us, and the cost in foreign currency as the rand has sunk over the past year, is astronomical. I'm afraid I don't have the figures here. But that was one of the largest items we found that we felt could easily be...
So we have more diplomatic missions than even a superpower like China?
Much more. Yeah. Many more. We are second only to the US.
That's astonishing. Now, in your proposal for how the DA would do it differently, you talk about funding the poor, the missing middle, and then the rich fund themselves. Is there enough money for no fees for the poor and the missing middle?
Well, I suppose you can have anything you want if you're prepared to cut out other things. So if you were prepared, say, to dispense entirely with a whole side of our health system or our basic education system, You could find enough to do it. I mean, there's a lot of money in the South African budget. The question is, how does one prioritize these things?
And is it your priority sense, you sense the priorities that fees should not be entirely free, even for the poor and the missing middle?
It's our priority that the poor should have no expenses.
Right.
That the state is obliged to support those who are admitted to university but would not be able to pay and therefore would not be able to attend, purely for financial reasons. And those are generally people that we define as having family incomes as below 200,000.
Yes.
If your family income is above that, we think you should be obliged to pay some of your costs.
And you think that is affordable without taking it from other essential services like health and basic education?
I think it's only affordable if implemented over time. I don't think say, for example, if we were to implement our scheme on the 1st of January next year, we could find the 20 billion that would be required.
It would be a process.
It would have to be a process.
We're going to have to stop there. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Professor Belinda Bozzoli. Belinda, I'm just interested, looking at your policy as the DA and comparing it to the ANC's, how does your policy compare with what the Freedom Charter said, which was written, of course, in 1956?
Well, the Freedom Charter is not really a DA document, so I'm not sure of the...
Well, did the Freedom Charter promise free education? That's something that's been debated, even at the tertiary level.
I don't know if it said at tertiary level. I think it said at basic level. But I may be thinking rather of the Constitution, which says free education would be ideal at the tertiary level, but would have to be introduced as means make it available, make it possible.
Available. You sit in Parliament whenever there are sessions. What's your sense of the atmosphere there? It just seems like looking at it from the outside, I think people watching this feel there's a breakdown. I mean, we have universities going through the worst crisis they've had in living memory, really, and yet you see no action from the president. The minister doesn't seem to be quite on top of things. Is that your sense? And is that something that you see in other parts of government as well?
I cannot tell you how despondent it makes me. This is exactly what we feel. Can I give you an example? When we held our emergency debate on the crisis in higher education, in late September.
Yes.
The Minister of Higher Education did not come. The Deputy Minister of Higher Education did not come. And I would say at least half of the ANC caucus came. Wow. Only half came.
Wow.
President nowhere to be seen. So the one opportunity one had to make a clear parliamentary sort of position on this was absolutely ignored by the ANC. And this is the feeling I get throughout. They don't really particularly care about universities. In many cases, I think they'd be only too pleased, really, if they were weakened, because they probably see them as a threat. Many of our MPs are very poorly educated. So to them, universities are simply an elite occupation. And the president has talked of clever blacks in a disparaging way. Clever blacks are really the baddies as far as he is concerned.
So it's the wrong sort of atmosphere. But there are plenty of ANC MPs who must be as despondent as you, who must react the same as you.
You know, I see them as many ANC MPs being despondent about Zuma generally.
Yes.
But not about universities so much. In fact, all one gets from is an enormous defensiveness about what they have achieved in universities. In fact, the same thing you get with all the ANC criticisms of the ANC. They cannot really understand that it's no longer any good to say, well, since 1994 we did this, 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 and the other, which they have done, and for which they deserve a lot of praise.
Right.
The current situation needs addressing in its own right. And they've done this with universities as well. But we double the numbers. We increase them. We transform them. They keep saying. And I think they're almost baffled as to what's the problem now, you know. They've done what they said they would do in their eyes.
Yes. One gets the sense watching it that there are so many younger opposition black members of parliament who are more dexterous and move faster. I wanted to ask you, I know this is treading slightly on the toes of a colleague, but the problem doesn't start at university level. We are spending a good amount of money on our high schools and primary schools, and yet we're not getting the result. Is that really primarily, would you blame the teachers' union for not imposing stricter discipline and standards?
Well, you know, like as is the case with higher education, these are all hugely complex problems. If you read our document, you must have noticed how complex it was, whereas often party releases are quite simple. They're one page long.
Yes.
And we tried to capture the complexity of it because we believe the public is unaware of quite how complex it is. And I think the same is the case in basic education. It is an enormously complex matter. It's a matter of poverty. It's a matter of equipment. It's a matter of buildings. It's a matter of teachers. It's a matter of headmistresses and masters, etc. But one of the keys to addressing those problems at schooling is to have a more answerable teacher cohort. And I think that's where Nahawa's resistance is a really serious blockage to an improvement in the system.
My last question for you is, you were, before you took on your role in Parliament, you were Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Wits. Are you glad you're not in that job now?
I'm glad, and I'm just saddened for management at the moment. It is incredibly difficult to go through this kind of thing. Most people in academia, you know, they're gentle people, they're intellectuals. They want a world of ideas to work. And
Yes.
they find themselves having to deal with this sort of hatred and division and factionalism and violence and things that are alien to university life.
Yes.
Very, very difficult.
Belinda Bozzoli, thanks very much for talking to us. Before we leave, I'm going to recommend a book, and the book I'm going to recommend is Rogue, The Inside Story of SARS's Elite Crime-Busting Unit by Johan van Lochrenberg. This really addresses what has been one of the most critical issues in South Africa's political troubles at the moment, because it deals with the battle that's going on between Pravin Gordhan at the Finance Ministry and President Zuma in the presidency. And you will have seen a lot of reports for a time blamed Pravin Gordhan for all the problems. And now Pravin Gordhan has started to fight back, and I think the public's view has changed. And this is a key book in that process. It's by one of the investigators working for SARS, whose life was discredited by the coverage and the reporting, claiming that he was involved in a rogue unit. He's now given his side of the story, and I think it's well worth a read. It's called Rogue, The Inside Story of SARS Elite Crime-Busting Unit by Johan van Lochrenberg. Well, that's all for us. Thanks for watching. Good night, and happy reading.